100 days ago, George Floyd died beneath the knee of a Minneapolis police officer as bystanders looked on in horror. The video shocked the country into action. We've now seen the longest and most widespread protests against police brutality of Black Americans, with millions taking part in demonstrations, virtual town halls, even strikes. America seems to be at a crucial moment. Police departments nationwide and in our area are moving to make reforms. Is it happening quickly enough? And will these reforms work? Tonight, we explore what's been accomplished in 100 days and discuss what equitable policing looks like for our community. This summer was certainly unlike any other we've seen in this country, and tonight we're talking about the facts. What should 21st century policing look like, and how can we keep all members of our community safe? Tonight's roundtable includes insight from Durham Police Chief C.J. Davis, Fayetteville Police Chief Gina Hawkins, Wake County Sheriff Gerald Baker, Hope County Sheriff Hubert Peterkin, social justice activist and filmmaker and North Carolina native Bree Newsom Bass, and former police officer and current criminal law professor at the University of South Carolina, Seth Stoughton, and Special Deputy Attorney General Jasmine McGee. We have a wonderful roundtable. I do want to begin with Chief Davis. About 24 hours ago, Chief, the North Carolina Association of Chiefs of Police released a list of reforms in response to calls for change, and one policy really stood out to me under the headline, "Preserve Life in All Use of Force Incidents." It said, quote, "Use of force training should be comprehensively reformed to incorporate preservation of life in every aspect of use of force." Chief Davis, what does this mean in practice?
Good evening, Lena, and again, thank you so much for the invite tonight. I was really pleased to hear the North Carolina Association of Chiefs of Police to lead in the state as well in some of the most important areas of use of force policy that the chiefs have galvanized and come together and to discuss how important it is for us to put life first. It doesn't matter what the situation is, what the objective is in any encounter with a law enforcement officer, whether you have to arrest an individual or not, the primary concern should be the preservation of life. No one should have to die because they committed a crime. So I'm very pleased to hear that David Hess, who is the president of the North Carolina Chiefs of the Police Association, has addressed the 8 Can't Wait. I wrote a statement myself today, so it's ironic that that has been put out to the public.
Chief Davis, I did want to follow up because often when we hear about the concept of shooting to kill, we're told that officers are trained that way, that if they have to use their guns, they are directing at the center mass. They are not shooting to wound. Does that mean that training would change? You would no longer shoot to kill?
Well, let me just back up just so that I could put some perspective about shooting to kill. First of all, officers are trained that they shouldn't disarm or be prepared to shoot unless they're in a life or death situation or information has been provided that would indicate that there's an individual with a gun that they would have to respond in that manner. So anytime an officer shoots his weapon, it's not to maim, it's not to slow a person down, because if that's what we want to do, we don't need to take the weapon out at all. If we're just trying to slow an individual down or we're trying to get control over a situation. You know, I've been in the business, and the folks here on the air have been in the business for a long time, and I have not seen in my career weapons being displayed as much as I have, you know, in the last 10 years or so. We were more of a hands-on kind of industry where, you know, we disarmed individuals sometimes, you know, who had weapons, and we were able to disarm them, even though they had weapons. So this is definitely a change that needs to happen.
Professor Stoughton, you have the unique perspective of being a former police officer. Now you're advocating for deep reform within the police. One policy recommendation from our state's newly formed Racial Equity Task Force is to require officers to intervene if they see another officer using excessive force. Do you think that the current culture of policing allows for officers to speak up against one another?
I think it's very difficult under the current culture. I think it's very easy for officers to be afraid of the professional and personal repercussions if they're viewed as not having their brother and sister officers' backs. That's one of the aspects of police culture that has to change. We have to make professionalism and peer expectations, that sense of accountability and service orientation at the core of police culture. And some agencies are doing that or have done that. If you look, for example, at the EPIC program, the Ethical Policing is Courageous program, and the New Orleans Police Department, they've put that concept of peer intervention at the center of their, that is by preventing your fellow officers from making what can be career-ending mistakes. So that's how you serve each other and the public.
And I want to stay on this concept of accountability with the Deputy Attorney General McGee, because you're a leader on the state's Racial Equity Task Force. You all recently released 5 reform recommendations for both the criminal justice system and police. But these recommendations are not state mandates. So how do you get buy-in from departments that maybe don't feel that they target Black or brown people in their community? And how do you enforce it?
I'll try that again. Thank you so much for having me. I'd say that the question of implementation of the recommendations of the task force are spot on. Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls have been clear that the task force is doing this work for transformational change over the long haul, and they don't want these recommendations to sit on a shelf after they are made. And so each one of these recommendations eventually is going to have a practical plan for how they can be done. And in doing this work, that includes talking to agencies and organizations that can help us achieve those goals. And it also includes considering rulemaking and legislative paths for implementation as well, and coordinating with the stakeholders who can help make that happen. We also know that the task force exists because of a movement driven by the people, and they are really essential partners in implementation as well. And so we need people to hold us accountable to make sure that we do what we say we will do, and that the culture change that Seth was just talking about really happens. That's the only way we'll be successful. I will say, from a personal perspective, as a Black woman working in criminal justice policy, I am incredibly hopeful about this moment. Even as I grapple with the pain of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, and so many others, and that our team, under the leadership of our co-chairs, is deeply committed to making sure that this work is real and impactful.
All right, coming up next, we're going to look at the police reform campaign, 8 Can't Wait, and examine how the policies are implemented in our local departments. We'll be right back. A lot to get to. Welcome back to this special live community conversation, Forward Together, Policing and Equality. The way George Floyd died, with that officer's knee against his neck, prompted calls for restrictions on the use of deadly force. The policing reform recommendations, better known as 8 Can't Wait, are policies advocates say can reduce police killings. You're looking at them, among them banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring warning before shooting, and banning shooting at moving vehicles. We do want to point out the knee-to-neck restraint used against Floyd is different from a chokehold and is banned in Raleigh, Durham, and in Fayetteville. Now let's get to Fayetteville's Chief Hawkins. I wanted to talk to you about another piece of police reform that we are beginning to see nationwide: how officers deal with mentally ill people. According to NPR, around 1 in 4 people fatally shot by police are struggling with some sort of mental health issue. Some departments are now creating mental or behavioral health first responders to respond to this particular group. Are you open to that?
First of all, thank you for having me, Lena. Of course, I'm absolutely open to that. I'm open for any extra efforts that the community can work together to assist us who are truly trained in that field. We as law enforcement have taken the training of crisis intervention training. We study about the different mental health issues that's going on in society in order to truly assess the situation. But definitely, we should all be definitely open to ways to mitigate the issues, especially when it deals with mental health.
I do want to follow up, though, because these are not police officers. These are people who are trained specifically in mental health, behavioral health. Are you open to having someone else respond to those calls?
Absolutely. I did understand your question, and I was very clear of understanding that they are civilians, even working within the police department, being accessible. I've heard and seen and reviewed those type of formats in other cities that have them. Definitely open for that. So absolutely.
Ms. Newsom-Bass, you and many other protesters are pushing to move money from police budgets into community-based groups, and you believe that could keep communities safer. How do you see that playing out specifically, and where have you seen it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the central issue is one of public health and safety, and quite frankly, bad policy for decades on the part of state and local governments, where marginalized communities are consistently deprived of basic needs, things like healthcare access, things like mental health care, just like was mentioned, safe and stable housing. And then police are used as kind of a catch-all for all of these issues. We think that we can prevent a lot of the conflicts that are happening if we were to invest in things like safe, stable housing, in things like funding mental health first responders. These things have been implemented in several cities around the nation. We have many instances of people in the community doing these things on their own, but it's very difficult if we don't have funding for it. And that's why we're calling for an investment in these exact kinds of measures to reduce the amount of interaction with police and to increase other forms of public health and social services.
When people hear defund police, they immediately think that this is a punishment for police departments, that you're taking money away because they've done something wrong. You are saying, though, that you believe these community groups would actually lower community violence. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. We can't keep using police as a catch-all for social issues and conflicts in our community. We know that it doesn't prevent crime. It doesn't address these issues. And quite frankly, even the 8 Can't Wait reforms, many of these things have already been in place, and it's not reducing the amount of police brutality or racism. These are things that are deeply entrenched in the culture and the structure of policing, as has already been named on this panel. So we just think that it's time to look at new solutions, new ways to address these issues. And part of it involves reassessing our funding priorities. Why are we constantly taking money from things like housing and healthcare and putting it into police and prisons? It's going to always result in the same outcomes.
And we certainly do plan to get reaction from some of the police chiefs that we have here tonight and hear what they think about potential money coming out of their budgets to go to some of these community services. But coming up next, are police unions part of the problem or the solution? Sheriffs from Wake and Hope County join us next on that. We'll be right back.
We want the family to know that even though it was not our agency that done it, we care about what happened. We don't want this to happen again. We want to do whatever we can to make sure that this don't continue in our communities, Gilbert.
That's Hope County Sheriff Hubert Peterkin. In that video, he's delivering remarks at Floyd's memorial that happened in Rayford, North Carolina. In this conversation around police reform, we often come back to the same discussion on the strength of police unions as a potential barrier to police reform. Sheriff Peterkin, do you think that's the case?
Yes, everything that I've read and heard about it, I'm sure it has some good points, but we cannot put ourselves in a position where we're insulated from being held accountable for doing wrong. So if the unions are protecting officers when they're wrong, then I have a problem with that. I think that's something that we really want to look at. In our state, we're not unionized here. So I really have a concern whenever I look at accountability and officers being insulated from being held accountable when something happens by a union.
And at the funeral, you spoke about the need for accountability and the need for officers to examine themselves. Do you think that's happening? Is it happening in your department?
It is happening here, and it's happening in police departments and sheriff officers across the state. But I think we need to do a better job. And we use the term here, policing each other. I heard earlier someone was speaking about officers not wanting to tell on another officer. We can't do that. If an officer is wrong, we tell our officers here that you have an obligation to report it. Now, is it something easy? No. With my experience with this over the years, it's like taboo to tell on another officer or even talk about another officer doing something wrong. But today, with the things that we're dealing with right now, we can't do that anymore. So I encourage all agencies throughout this state and all other states to make sure that we are policing each other, and finally, not just the officers, but the managers as well.
Mm-hmm. And Sheriff Baker, officers really are under so much scrutiny right now. Have you found that your deputies are open to reform, or are they feeling overwhelmed by the spotlight?
Well, we're certainly open to reform. You know, that's one of the things that I've campaigned about coming to office and this administration from day one. Sheriff talked about accountability. That's what I want to bring back to this office, being accountable for what we do. If our officers make a mistake out there and make the wrong decision, I don't believe in mistakes. You know, when you get this part of life in this age, and with the training and all that we have to be law enforcement officers, you know, it pretty comes down to making bad decisions, and so we must be responsible for that as well. And so, you know, we talk about training. You know, that same training that each of us receive in basic law enforcement training is that same training that should keep us from taking someone's life out there. Our job is to save lives, not to take it. And so when we look at what's going on across the country, and it happens to be officers who are taking the lives of people of color, you've got to stop and ask, you know, you start talking about training and de-escalation. Well, all those things come with that certification that you receive from successfully completing basic law enforcement training. So now we're talking about the officers themselves, the individuals. It goes deep. If you're in this profession, I've made it very clear in this office, if you are one that have a problem with people of color or people who are not, that don't look like you, then come see me. We need to talk about that. This may not be the place for you. This may not be the profession for you, because we must, as chiefs and sheriffs throughout this country, hold each and every person accountable.
And Sheriff Baker, we're going to continue in the next half hour. This has been such an insightful conversation. We will continue online at WRAL.com. Please join us there. A lot more questions to ask of this incredible panel. Hope we'll see you in 60 seconds. We are coming up on 7:30. Thanks so much for sticking with us for this special Report Forward Together, a roundtable discussion on policing and equality. I'm Lena Tillett. Our conversation now streaming on our WRAL digital platforms until 8 o'clock. I did want to go back to Sheriff Baker, because Sheriff Baker, I think you said something that was very interesting, where you said that you all get sufficient training. So there could be something else happening that's allowing officers to make choices that you don't agree with when it comes to Black and brown people. Can you expound on that, please?
Yes, and again, you know, it comes down to that officer who is out there in the line of duty, and when it comes to effecting an arrest, we have that training. That's why he's there. He's been through it, and he knows how much to apply. When you start talking about a force continuum, you know, how much force, what level, and at what point do you stop and taking a person into custody. You've got a person that's handcuffed on the ground. He's not resisting anymore. So at that point, the force level stops at that point. That's when you start trying to take the person into custody. You don't continue to apply force when it's not necessary. So that, when you start talking about more training, well, more training is going to always be great, and we all want it. But I think we're talking about, we need to now start talking about what's really going on out there. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to be involved in that.
Professor Stoughton, I want to stay on this topic of training, specifically talking about field training officers, FTOs, known to police as FTOs. And these tend to be senior officers training rookies in the field. Former Officer Derek Chauvin was an FTO, training the day he knelt on Floyd's neck. How challenging is it for departments to make sure that rookies are getting proper training and not getting bad habits from older cops?
It's difficult just because of the nature of policing, right? Policing is not something that is done under the close supervision of a corporal or sergeant or lieutenant, depending on how the agency structures its ranks. A great deal of policing, including a great deal of police training and an FTO program, a field training program, happens with the officer out in the field, and the FTO is the only other officer nearby. So there are some technological tools that we could use. Body cameras can help a little bit around the edges, but really the best way of making sure that FTOs are teaching young officers what they need to be taught is making sure that you have the right FTOs, that they have not just the skills and the knowledge, but that they have the right value system, that they're going to share that value system with the recruits. And making sure that the supervisors of a field training unit are active, not just in supervising the police civilian encounters, but also active in supervising how the FTOs are actually doing their instruction.
Why did you decide to get into reform work after being a police officer? Was there something that happened in your career?
No, there wasn't. When I went to law school, after having left the police department and after having left a position as a state investigator to go to law school, I thought I was done with criminal law and policing entirely, and then studying it from a legal and academic perspective kind of pulled me back in. First, with the realization that sometimes the laws and the policies that are built around regulating the police don't really understand what policing looks like on the field. And this is not a surprise. The Supreme Court justices who are creating Fourth Amendment doctrines haven't been police officers. So I started to get at it from the sort of legal reform. And then I happened to start my career here at the University of South Carolina in the summer of 2014, which was a very natural time to focus not just on legal reform, but also on social and cultural reform within policing.
It's probably a good time then to go to Bree Newsome Bass, because I wanted to ask about 2015 when you scaled that flagpole in South Carolina after the Mother Emanuel shooting, where a white supremacist shot and killed 9 parishioners in that church. And you took down the Confederate flag from the State House grounds. I wonder if you can talk about the difference between then and now. Then it was considered a radical act. In the past 100 days, we've seen more Confederate symbols and monuments come down than in any other time in history. What did you see then about the power of those symbols that the country is seeing now?
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's a reminder again that what seems radical in a moment, especially when it comes to issues of justice, proves to be right over time, right? There was a time when calling for the abolition of slavery was radical. There was a time when calling for desegregation in the South was radical, and people were arrested for violating segregation laws. And it's the same thing that happened in 2015, where we had a situation of the state basically endorsing a symbol of hate and refusing to lower it on the State House grounds. And, you know, it's important to take a stand in certain moments to really remind people what it is to be on the right side of history. And I think what we're seeing play out now is people more and more coming into that realization that even though we have come a long way, racism is still very much embedded in the fabric of our society. And we can't go forward until we really address this and deal with it.
I want to go back to Chief Davis. You recently had an incident happen in Durham. You and I spoke about this a bit, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about it to the people in this community. Officers pointed guns at a 15-year-old who matched the description of someone you were looking for, wasn't the person. Other children were there. Their parents told us they were traumatized by that event. You did release a statement saying that you apologized to the family directly. Can you share your thoughts on what happened there? And do you think that you'll have to regain the community's trust after an event like that?
Well, Lena, we always have to work on regaining trust, you know, just by virtue of the nature of the business that we're in. You know, officers are responding, and I know you probably are aware too, and around the country, there has been such an uptick in gun violence in our communities. And in this particular situation, you know, even though we respond in a way where we're really trying to go and deal with one situation, it should never be the outcome that the community is harmed in the process. So, this is part of what we need to look at as it relates to the training that we're talking about. How do we ensure that we respond to mitigate a situation, but at the same time, don't cause harm to the community as well? And children are always, in the community is theirs, and they should be safe in the community that they live in.
And what did you share with the family who said that their kids were traumatized? I mean, how can you help with that?
Well, my talking to the parents had absolutely nothing to do with, just feeling like I needed to protect the police department. As a mother, as a aunt, as a mentor, I am very sensitive to children's needs, and our children are already exposed to too much. They're exposed and their innocence is taken away. And the last thing I want is for our department to be a part of causing any kind of harm to our children. So my conversation with them was early on, and it was a good conversation. I had an opportunity to really talk to the kids because that's who I wanted to talk to. I wanted to sit down and talk to them and let them know that in no way are we ever intending to hurt our community or to expose them to fear or trauma or anything like that. So I felt that was a great opportunity for me to do that. And I felt good that they knew where my heart was and the work that I'm doing with the police department.
I want to go to Chief Hawkins now. I've had so many conversations with you where you talk about how you prioritize community policing. I wanted to ask you something that I hadn't really thought about until I was reading some of the work from the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit organization that looks at the criminal justice system. And they were talking about the importance of having officers live in the communities that they police, because these officers are in some cases only engaging with the community in a time of crises or distress or on people's worst day. And I wonder if you think that can naturally skew an officer's perception of a community if they don't live there.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So I think there are definitely advantages to living in a community that you're policing. But there's also the opportunity that's not an absolute. You can still provide respect, empathy, and understanding to a community that you're working in. It is an advantage because like I walk my neighborhood all the time, and I don't walk in a uniform. I walk in plain clothes, but by happenstance, they don't know who I am without the uniform until I tell them. But you're able to build those relationships and see reflective. So I definitely see the advantage of it, but I don't think it's an absolute that you absolutely have to live in the communities, but it's definitely an advantage because you might, like we have take-home cars. The community gets to see, oh, that's an officer that lives in my community. And even the feeling of feeling safer should exist, or the opportunity to have a relationship built should exist. We have an incentive here in Fayetteville that might provide an advantage for officers to live that the city provided. So that's definitely an incentive and advantage for the community as a whole. Of really sharing information, because officers know about community watch groups. Officers know all the resources that the community needs to be educated about what we're doing as a police department, which to me is the more important thing as a nation we should be understanding. When we start empowering each other, not just the officers, the community, and understanding what their police department is doing, what resources they have available, how to get more engaged with them, then everybody has input and should be able to provide if they want to see it differently. So that's more to me what community policing, empowering all the residents to get to know their police department, their police officers, and the resources and the services that department provides. A lot of people don't even know that, but it's important for that to be occurring right now.
Are you trying to hire more Black and Latino officers to reflect Fayetteville?
So I'm definitely, what law enforcement, what any entity can do is definitely recruit for minorities. And that's an absolute. One thing we're trying to see if we can get through is have a cadet program for residents of the city. So we want representation of the city. And if you're living here, that might be an advantage to start that process, but definitely recruiting from the community. whatever minority exists, but we are targeting right now minorities when we go out for recruiting in that aspect.